April 29, 1945. It is a Sunday afternoon. American soldiers from the 45th Thunderbird Infantry Division approach a compound 10 miles outside Munich. They move with caution. They have been in combat for over 500 consecutive days. They fought through the heat of Sicily and the beaches of Anzio. They survived Salerno in southern France. Now they operate deep inside Germany. The unit has lost 75% of its personnel to casualties. They are exhausted, hardened, angry. What could break men who have lived through 2 years of continuous warfare? They thought they had seen it all, but nothing prepared them for this. First, the smell hits them, a stench so overpowering that the lead elements stop in their tracks. Some soldiers vomit on the spot. One man guesses it is a chemical factory. Another suggests burning feathers. But this was only the beginning. At first glance, a line of standard freight cars, but in reality, a stationary tomb. Then they see it. 39 railway boxcars sit on a siding near the camp entrance. The footage shows soldiers prying open the heavy sliding doors. Inside, those cars are the bodies of nearly 2,500 human beings. They are stacked like cordwood, limbs tangled, eyes open, staring. This is the Dachau death train. I am warning you now. What these soldiers found and the violence they unleashed in response will shake your understanding of war. Justice blurred into revenge. There was no going back. March 22nd, 1933. That was the date the nightmare began. Heinrich Himmler stood in Munich and announced the opening of a new facility. It was the first concentration camp for political prisoners. The location was a defunct munitions factory in Dachau. The site sat 10 miles northwest of Munich. It looked like a picturesque Bavarian town, but the calm was deceptive. Himmler declared the camp would hold 5,000 inmates, communists, socialists, trade unionists, anyone who refused to bow to the new regime. This was not just a prison. This was the prototype. The first trucks rolled through the gates that March. 200 men stepped onto the gravel, political opponents, journalists who wrote the wrong words, union leaders, local officials who denied loyalty to Hitler. In days, the population swelled. In weeks, 5,000 men crammed into the barracks. These were not street criminals. These were judges, writers, and leaders, Germany's elite. They arrived without trial, without charges, without a release date. Who could manage such industrial cruelty? A normal officer would fail, but Theodor Eicke was not normal. He was an SS Oberfuhrer with a history of instability. He had previously been committed to a psychiatric clinic. Hitler pulled him out. He handed him the keys to Dachau in June 1933. Eicke did not just manage the camp, he reinvented it. He introduced a doctrine of dehumanization. To him, prisoners were not men. They were numbers, assets to be used until failure. He designed a discipline system meant to shatter the mind before the body. Corporal punishment became routine. Prisoners were strapped to wooden benches. The whip cracked. 25 lashes, 75 lashes. The strikes tore skin and exposed muscle. Many died from shock on the spot. Others were thrown into solitary confinement. These were not cells. They were stone boxes too small to stand in, too narrow to lie down in. The body cramped, the mind unraveled. At first glance, a system of order, but in reality, a school of sadism. Eicke forced prisoners to police each other. Collective punishment turned victims into enforcers. The guards faced a simple choice: show mercy and face dismissal, show cruelty and earn a promotion. Brutality became a career path. The system worked perfectly. Eicke was promoted to inspector of all camps. He took the Dachau manual and exported it. Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, even Auschwitz. Every site of terror that followed was built on the foundation laid in that Bavarian factory. But this was only the beginning. In the first year, the goal was intimidation: arrest the opposition, break them, release them. Men returned to their families after months of torture. Their eyes were empty, their bodies were scarred. They walked the streets of Berlin and Munich as living warnings. The message was silent, but deafening. Oppose us and this happens to you. By 1935, the purpose shifted. The camp opened its gates to new enemies: Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to salute, Roma people labeled racially inferior, homosexuals marked with pink triangles, repeat criminals classified as asocials. The definitions of enemy expanded daily. Then came November 1938, Kristallnacht. Glass shattered across Germany, synagogues burned. The police rounded up 10,000 Jewish men. They herded them into Dachau. This was a turning point. These men had committed no political crime. Their crime was existence. The guards singled them out. They received the heaviest labor, the worst beatings, the constant mockery. The footage shows men in striped uniforms collapsing under the weight of stones. Many died within weeks. Others were offered a deal. Sign over your property. Leave Germany immediately. Never return. It was extortion on a national scale. The regime made its stance clear. Leave or die. The camp gates remained open. The war was approaching. Leave or die. There was no third option. The camp did not just exist, it metastasized throughout the war. By 1944, Dachau had transformed into a colossal network. Over 150 subcamps stretched across the map of southern Germany and Austria. Prisoners became cogs in a massive machine. They toiled as slave labor in armaments factories. They poured concrete for construction projects. Corporate giants profited from this misery. BMW, Messerschmitt, the engines of the German war effort ran on the backs of starving men. Why did the regime feed them at all? It seemed like mercy, but in reality, it was a calculation to extract the last ounce of energy before death. The system was engineered to kill slowly. The diet was a weapon. Rations consisted of brown water masquerading as soup, a sliver of bread, perhaps a single potato. The caloric math was brutal. Prisoners consumed maybe 1,000 calories a day, but their heavy labor burned 3,000 or more. The result was biological cannibalism. The body began to consume itself. Muscles atrophied. Fat vanished. Within weeks, healthy men turned into walking skeletons. Work details were designed to break the body. Prisoners hauled massive stones up steep slopes. They dug ditches in frozen earth. They built roads for 12 to 14 hours a day. There was no safety. Guards struck without warning. A whip cracked across a back. A club smashed a knee. Fists flew for a mistake, or simply because a guard was bored. Then came the roll calls. Prisoners stood at attention on the Appellplatz. They stood for hours in freezing rain. They stood in heavy snow. They stood under the blistering summer heat. The footage shows a prisoner's knees buckle. He collapses to the pavement. A guard steps forward and beats him where he lies. Collapse meant punishment. Often, it meant a bullet. This was psychological warfare. The goal was to shatter the human spirit. Guards forced men to crawl through the mud. They forced them to sing songs praising their tormentors. They forced them to watch as friends were tortured nearby. But physical exhaustion was only one layer of the nightmare. Medical doctors viewed the inmates as laboratory animals. Dr. Sigmund Rascher led the descent into madness. He conducted some of the most horrific experiments in the history of medicine at Dachau. He wanted to know survival times for Luftwaffe pilots downed in the North Sea. So he used live subjects. Rascher submerged prisoners in tanks of ice water, not for minutes, for hours, sometimes 9 hours or more. At first glance, a medical test, but in reality, torture disguised as science. Most subjects died in the tank. Those who survived the cold were often thrown back in. Rascher froze them again and again until the heart stopped. Then he turned his eyes to the sky. He placed prisoners in pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude conditions. He ramped the pressure up to 68,000 feet. The camera records a man convulsing in the chamber. He screams as the oxygen is sucked out. The physics were devastating. Lungs ruptured, brains hemorrhaged, eardrums exploded, bodies came apart from the inside. Rascher filmed these experiments. The reels still exist in the archives today. He did not stop there. He injected veins with malaria and tuberculosis to test experimental drugs. If the drugs failed, the prisoner died slowly from the disease. Hundreds perished. Survivors were left permanently crippled. Justice eventually came for the doctors at Nuremberg. Most were hanged, but Rascher never faced that tribunal. The SS arrested him in 1944, not for murder, for falsifying documents. Himmler gave the order. A firing squad executed Rasher shortly before the war ended, but Dachau was distinct. It was not primarily an extermination camp like Auschwitz or Treblinka. There were no industrial gas chambers designed for mass slaughter. It was a prison, a work camp. Death here was intimate. It came from brutality, from disease, from starvation, from total neglect. That distinction did not save lives. When American forces breached the gates in April 1945, the smell of death was overwhelming. At least 32,000 prisoners had died within Dachau and its subcamps. Many more were shipped away to extermination centers. The true death toll remains a mystery. As Allied forces approached, the SS burned the files. April 1945. April 1945. Germany was collapsing. Soviet forces were closing the net from the east. American and British armor swept across the west. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was trapped in a concrete bunker, waiting for the inevitable. The war was clearly lost. But for the prisoners at Dachau, the final weeks did not bring relief. They brought new terrors. The SS High Command began a frantic evacuation of camps in the path of Allied armies. They forced prisoners onto the roads. In late April, at least 7,000 inmates from Dachau and its subcamps were driven toward the Austrian Alps. It was a death march. Thousands died on the asphalt and in the mud. Exhaustion, starvation, exposure. The sound of pistol shots marked the miles. Guards executed anyone who collapsed. April 26th. Camp Commandant Martin Weiss made his choice. He gathered most of the regular SS guards, loaded vehicles with supplies, and fled. He abandoned the camp to its fate. Who was left to guard the perimeter? Weiss left the facility in the hands of Heinrich Wicker, a low-ranking officer with approximately 560 personnel. At first glance, a military force, but in reality, a penal battalion. These were not elite troops. They were inmates from the SS disciplinary prison inside Dachau, criminals and troublemakers serving punishment tours. Alongside them stood Hungarian Waffen-SS troops who barely spoke German. None of them wanted to be there. None of them wanted to fight the Americans. They just wanted to survive the coming storm. But chaos was spreading beyond the wire. April 28th, an armed resistance group in the town of Dachau launched a desperate uprising. Former prisoners Georg Scherer and Walter Neff led local civilians in an attack on the town hall. Their goal was simple: prevent the SS from liquidating the remaining prisoners. It was a suicide mission. By midday, Waffen-SS units crushed the revolt. The resistance fighters were executed in the streets or scattered into the shadows. That same day, April 28th, a train arrived at Dachau. It had departed Buchenwald on April 7th. 5,000 prisoners were packed into boxcars. The SS had given them rations for exactly 1 day. The journey was supposed to take 48 hours. Instead, the train wandered through the ruins of Europe for 3 weeks. Allied bombing had destroyed the tracks. Military convoys blocked the routes. The train moved blindly through Saxony, Czechia, and Bavaria. It stopped. It started. It sat idle for days. Inside the locked cars, there was no food, no water, no sanitation. Men died by the hundreds in the darkness. At Nammering in Lower Bavaria, the train stopped on April 21st. The doors opened. Prisoners who could still stand were ordered to unload the corpses. They buried them in the fields. Approximately 800 bodies were left behind at Nammering. The SS guards murdered even more during the unloading, shooting anyone who moved too slowly. When the train finally reached Dachau on the afternoon of April 28th, silence reigned. Between 2,000 and 3,000 prisoners were dead inside the boxcars. Only about 800 were still alive, barely. The footage shows skeletal figures lying in piles. The SS left the train sitting on a railway siding near the camp entrance. No one bothered to unload the bodies. No one gave water to the survivors. 39 boxcars sat baking in the spring sunshine. By the next morning, April 29th, more survivors had died. The death toll inside those cars reached approximately 2,310 people. Some had starved. Some died of disease. Some simply gave up. The smell was overpowering. It drifted across the fields, detectable from hundreds of yards away. April 29, 1945. dawn. American forces from 3 divisions converged on the Dachau area. Major General Harry Collins commanded the 42nd Rainbow Infantry Division. Major General Robert Frederick led the 45th Thunderbird Infantry Division. The 27th Tank Battalion of the 20th Armored Division roared in support. The soldiers had been informed of a camp nearby, but they were not ready for what waited on the tracks. Sunday morning, April 29, 1945. The units had received the coordinates. They knew a facility existed near Munich, but they did not know the reality. Why did the soldiers dismiss the rumors? Stories of German camps had circulated for years. There was talk of mistreatment of Jews and political prisoners. But logic told the troops this was exaggerated propaganda. Lieutenant William J. Walsh admitted the truth later. Back in the States, he heard the stories. He simply did not believe them. Elements of the 42nd and 45th Divisions raced toward the objective. Historians still argue about the timeline. Both units claimed the honor of liberation. But the debate is irrelevant. What matters is what they found. Soldiers from both divisions stood witness to the events that followed. 1,200 hours. American troops approached Dachau from the southern perimeter. Resistance was immediate. 30 SS troopers manned the outer defenses. These were young fanatics who refused to flee with the regular guards. They opened fire. A firefight erupted instantly. The Americans did not hesitate. They were veterans of the European theater. They returned fire, flanked the positions, and silenced the guns. The skirmish was short, but as they advanced, the air changed. It wasn't a smell anyone could identify at first. Some thought it was chemicals. Others described burning feathers or rotting meat. It was heavy, sweet, and unnatural. The odor grew stronger with every step. Soldiers tied handkerchiefs over their noses. They pulled their collars up. It did not help. The stench penetrated the fabric. It stuck to their skin. Private First Class. John Lee rounded a bend. Before him lay the railway siding. 39 boxcars sat idle under the spring sun. Some doors stood open, others remained sealed. At first glance, a supply train, but in reality, a tomb. Lee froze. Other soldiers moved up behind him, weapons raised. They approached cautiously. They expected an ambush. They found something else. The sight inside the boxcars defied human comprehension. Hundreds of corpses filled the wagons. Thousands followed. Emaciated bodies wore striped prisoner uniforms. Some lay naked. Others were partially clothed in rags. They were stacked on top of each other like cordwood. The footage shows eyes are open, staring at nothing. Some were wrapped in thin blankets. Some had been dead for weeks. Decomposition had set in. Bodies were bloated. Skin had turned black and green. Beside them lay those who had just died. Their flesh was still fresh. The soldiers stood in silence. They were not rookies. They had fought for over 2 years. They had seen men blown apart by artillery. They had smelled flesh burned by flamethrowers. They had stepped over friends shot by snipers. But this was different. This wasn't combat. This was murder. Systematic, calculated, industrial murder. Technical Sergeant Peter J. Galerio described the scene to investigators. He estimated 200 to 300 dead in a single heap. Half naked, skin and bones. He recalled his exact words. "Oh my God, what the hell is going on here?" Private First Class. Clifford Barrett remembered the smell decades later. It was the most terrible odor of his life. He noted that bodies merged into one another. You couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. But this was only the beginning. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks wrote in his memoir, "The memory would haunt him forever. The odor of death was overpowering. Soldiers tried to count the victims. They walked down the line of cars. 1, 2, 10, 50. They gave up. The bodies were too decomposed to separate. The sheer volume overwhelmed them. Reaction took over discipline. Several soldiers fell to their knees and vomited. Others wept openly. Some stood in silent, shaking rage. But one emotion united the group: fury. Absolute burning fury at the perpetrators. The death train broke something inside these men. They were hardened warriors. The 45th Infantry Division had been in continuous combat since November 1942. They had stormed the beaches of Sicily in July 1943. They had survived Italy and France, but nothing prepared them for Munich. Thus ended their innocence. July 1943. That was when they first tasted combat. They landed on the beaches of Sicily and pushed forward. The unit fought through the entire grinding Italian campaign, Salerno, Anzio. The names became synonymous with slaughter. Casualties were devastating. In August 1944, they invaded southern France. They fought through the freezing mud of the Vosges Mountains. They crossed the border into Germany and breached the concrete teeth of the Siegfried Line. For 2 years, they lived under fire. Shells screamed overhead, bombs shook the ground. They saw friends dismembered by artillery or burned alive inside tanks. 75% of the original division was gone, replaced by fresh faces. The survivors were exhausted. Their uniforms were stained with grease and blood. They were angry at the world. But seeing these boxcars full of murdered civilians changed everything. The footage shows open train cars on the siding. Inside, piles of skeletal bodies are visible. This was evidence of calculated cruelty. It wasn't war. It was extermination. Sergeant Peter Gallery turned to the men around him. He put it simply. Let's get those Nazi dogs. Take no prisoners. Don't take any SS alive. Why did seasoned soldiers break the rules? They had followed the Geneva Conventions for years, but the sight of the death train erased all protocols. The sentiment spread through the American ranks instantly. Within minutes, the mindset shifted. These soldiers had treated captured Germans humanely in Italy and France, even when those Germans had killed their friends. But they decided that SS guards did not deserve those protections. The rules did not apply anymore. Not here. Not after seeing the train. Events accelerated. As American forces moved past the death train toward the camp perimeter, they encountered the SS guards. Chaos erupted. Some Germans fled toward the woods. Others threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Some remained in defensive positions in guard towers, firing down at the Americans. The return fire was instant. Heavy machine gun fire suppressed the resistance. Several guards dropped dead in the initial exchange. These were legitimate combat casualties, but then the line blurred. At first glance, a firefight, but in reality, an execution. The shooting did not stop when the hands went up. Guards who surrendered were shot anyway. Wounded SS men lay on the concrete. American soldiers walked up and finished them with bullets to the head. The laws of war disintegrated with every step closer to the camp walls. By approximately 3 p.m., Brigadier General Henning Linden of the 42nd Infantry Division arrived at the camp's command post. He found SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Wicker waiting. Wicker was the acting commander. The regular SS officers had already fled. He formally surrendered the camp to General Linden. Wicker followed the protocol. He handed over control. He expected the Geneva Conventions to protect him. He anticipated interrogation, processing, and a prisoner of war camp. He was wrong. Instead, within hours, he would be dead, executed by American soldiers or beaten to death by the liberated prisoners. The exact circumstances of Wicker's death remain a mystery. 2 versions of the death existed. One account claimed American bullets cut him down. The other suggested a darker fate, beaten to death by the very men he enslaved. The exact end of Commandant Wicker remains a mystery, but the result was absolute. He did not survive the sunset. General Linden moved past the body. He brought witnesses. Reporters followed the jeep, including Marguerite Higgins from the New York Herald Tribune. She was one of the few female correspondents covering the European front. She adjusted her helmet. She prepared her notebook, but nothing could prepare her for the smell. What they found inside defied language. Why was the camp bursting at the seams? The SS had panicked. Soviet tanks rolled from the east. American armor pressed from the west. The Germans frantically moved prisoners to the center, creating a bottleneck of misery. The camp's architect originally planned for 6,000 inmates, maybe 8,000 at the absolute limit. But on Liberation Day, 32,000 people fought for oxygen. Every available inch was occupied. Barracks designed for 250 men now held 1,600. Wooden bunks were stacked 3 high. 3 or 4 skeletons shared a space meant for 1 healthy man. Turning over was impossible. Stretching out was a fantasy. Men slept sitting up. Others slept standing, supported only by the crush of bodies around them. They took turns lying on the filth-covered floor. Starvation did the work of bullets. The SS had stopped issuing food weeks ago. The ovens ran day and night, but the volume was too high. The machinery failed. The footage shows the result. Bodies stacked outside the crematorium. They were piled like cordwood, waiting for fire that never came. The air was heavy, the scent of rotting flesh mixed with the fumes of overflowing latrines. It created a chemical smog of death. American GIs choked. They called it hell on earth. Inside the barracks, the living looked like the dead. Emaciated figures lay on the planks. They were too weak to lift their heads. Typhus swept through the blocks. Body lice carried the fever from bunk to bunk. Sanitation had collapsed months prior. There was no water, there was no medicine. Tuberculosis ate away their lungs. Years of inhaling toxic factory fumes and crematorium smoke finished them off. Dysentery dehydrated the rest. The sound of coughing was constant. Every breath tasted of decay. The liberators stopped cold. Battle-hardened soldiers walked in stunned silence. One GI fell to his knees and vomited. Another wept openly. He did not wipe the tears. He did not care who saw. Their shock turned into something else. Rage. Faces contorted. Knuckles turned white on rifle grips. One soldier wrote a letter home that night. He used plain words. "I have seen death before, but I have never seen murder on this scale." This was not combat. This was an industrial slaughterhouse. This was evil made solid. Marguerite Higgins recorded the scene for the American public. She described thousands of bloodshot eyes staring in disbelief. At first glance, a silent graveyard, but in reality, a volcano of emotion. A tremendous roar erupted. Discipline vanished. Men and women screamed. They howled. These were people who could barely stand, yet they found the energy to run. They surged toward the gates. They reached out. They needed to verify the soldiers were real. The barriers broke. Prisoners embraced the Americans. They kissed their dusty boots. They lifted heavy soldiers onto frail shoulders. A babble of languages filled the air. Polish, Russian, French, German, Italian, Hungarian. They tried to speak English. When words failed, they used gestures. Some fell to the ground, sobbing into the dirt. Others linked arms. They danced in circles. They spun until their legs gave out and they collapsed from sheer exhaustion. For 32,000 souls, liberation meant survival. They had made it. They had endured years of torture. They had watched friends vanish. They had waited for their turn. And they survived. But for the Americans, the war changed in that instant. It was no longer about maps or territory. It wasn't about politics. It was a crusade against absolute evil. They saw the factories built for human destruction. They realized what the enemy was capable of. And that is when the discipline snapped. The killing began. Lieutenant William P. Walsh commanded Company 1 of the 157th Infantry. He stood near the camp's back entrance. He found a boxcar. Inside were 4 German soldiers. They had already surrendered to other troops. The Germans had their hands in the air. They were unarmed. Under the Geneva Convention, they were protected prisoners of war. The protocol was clear. Process them, interrogate them, move them to the rear. Walsh ignored the protocol. He did not call for MPs. He reached for his holster. He pulled out a .45 caliber pistol. 4 loud cracks echoed in the rail yard. The Germans fell one by one. Private Albert C. Pruitt watched it happen. One by one, the bodies hit the ground. Private Albert C. Pruitt did not hesitate. He climbed directly into the boxcar where the wounded Germans lay. They were already down. They were bleeding. But Pruitt raised his weapon and performed the coup de grace. He put bullets into their heads to ensure they never stood up again. This was murder. It was clear, unambiguous, and premeditated. Why did American soldiers break the rules? The Germans had surrendered and were legally disarmed prisoners of war. But logic meant nothing here. Rage took over. Lieutenant Walsh watched the execution and felt nothing. He had just walked past the death train parked outside the camp. He had seen the emaciated corpses stacked like firewood. He had smelled the rotting flesh. In that moment, He decided these Germans did not deserve to live. The footage shows other American soldiers stand nearby, watching the summary execution. Some troops nodded in approval, others checked their weapons. They prepared to join the violence that would follow. Near the camp's coal yard, the situation escalated. American soldiers herded a group of SS guards together. These men had surrendered or been captured during the sweep. Now, they stood against a wall, their boots sinking into black coal dust. Accounts vary wildly about the next few minutes. The controversy has persisted for 79 years, but the basic facts remain undisputed. Someone pulled the trigger. It might have been Lieutenant Walsh. It might have been other soldiers from the 45th Division acting on impulse, or perhaps a superior officer gave the nod. The result was the same. Automatic weapons opened fire. The sound of machine gun fire ripped through the air. Bullets raked the coal yard. The SS guards fell screaming. Some died instantly, their bodies jerking from the impact. Others collapsed, wounded, crying out for help that would never come. The Americans did not stop. They systematically walked through the fallen guards. They shot the wounded in the head. They finished them off with pistols at close range. At first glance, a secured perimeter, but in reality, a slaughterhouse. Blood pooled on the black ground, bodies piled up. The killing continued until Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks sprinted to the scene. He saw the carnage. He shouted at his men. He ordered the firing to stop immediately. But this was only the beginning of the mystery. How many died in that coal yard? The number remains one of the most controversial aspects of the Dachau liberation. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, commander of the 3rd Battalion, 157th Infantry, gave his account. He claimed he arrived moments after the shooting began. He estimated that exactly 16 SS guards lay dead in the coal yard. He noted one additional death, a guard killed by a liberated prisoner who had snatched a rifle from an American soldier. Official records back this up. Lieutenant Colonel Walter J. Fellens prepared a report for the 7th Army just weeks after the liberation. He stated that 17 guards were killed in the coal yard, 16 or 17. These numbers suggest a brief, violent loss of control that Sparks quickly contained. But other witnesses tell a dramatically different story. Colonel Howard A. Buchner was the chief medical officer of the 45th Infantry Division. He was there. In 1986, he published a book titled The Hour of the Avenger. His claims were explosive. Buchner agreed that 30 SS guards died during the initial fighting, but then his numbers skyrocketed. He claimed 122 guards were executed immediately after capture in various spots. And at the coal yard in Tower B, Buchner alleged a mass atrocity. He described 346 SS guards lined up against walls and machine-gunned to death. He did not stop there. He claimed another 40 guards were beaten to death by liberated prisoners while American soldiers watched or assisted. Buchner's total, 538 SS guards killed in summary executions on April 29, 1945. If true, this would make the Dachau Massacre one of the largest war crimes committed by American forces in the European theater. But here is the problem. Most historians reject Buchner's numbers. They view them as wildly exaggerated or completely fabricated. Let's examine the evidence. Buchner's credibility took a devastating blow in 1987. That year, the U.S. Army declassified his original sworn statement from May 1945. In the archives, a yellowed document signed by Buchner. This statement was given to investigators just 2 weeks after the liberation. The events were fresh in his mind. In this official record, Buchner claimed he personally saw only 15 or 16 Germans shot by American soldiers. Not 538, not 346, just 15 or 16. Years later, in his book, that number had somehow grown to over 500. The math simply did not add up. 538. That was the new number on the page. When confronted about this massive discrepancy, Buchner didn't blink. He claimed he had lied to investigators back in 1945 to protect his fellow soldiers. He insisted his book, published decades later, finally told the truth. But this explanation triggers immediate skepticism. Why would a man lie under oath when the events were fresh, only to reveal the truth as an elderly man? Memory fades. Ink does not. If 538 SS guards had been executed in a systematic mass killing, the evidence would be undeniable. It would be physical. The U.S. Army Signal Corps was not absent. They were everywhere. The footage shows cameramen moving through the mud, the camera records, shutters clicking at every turn. They documented the horror of the death train from multiple angles. They filmed the barracks. They captured the smoke rising from the crematorium. They framed the piles of bodies. We see the liberation itself, prisoners cheering, emaciated hands reaching through barbed wire. We see SS guards being rounded up, hands on their heads searched for weapons. The archives hold hundreds of photographs from April 29, 1945. There is no shortage of film. And yes, the photos exist. Dead SS guards lie at the base of the towers. Bodies are scattered in the coal yard. But there is a gap, a massive visual void. There are no photographs of 500 men being lined up. There are no images of 346 corpses stacked against a wall. If a massacre of that magnitude occurred, a cameraman would have filmed it, either as proof of justice or simply because it was happening in front of him. The absence of these images is not proof of innocence, but it casts a long shadow over Buechner's claims. The official record tells a different, sharper story. Multiple independent investigations by the U.S. Army began immediately. They did not find 500 bodies. They estimated the total at 30 to 50 SS guards killed by American troops. These were not casual inquiries. Investigators interviewed dozens of soldiers. They walked the grounds. They examined the bodies. They documented the crime scenes with cold precision. There was no political reason to minimize the count. In fact, the Army needed an accurate log of events to determine if court-martials were necessary. The most credible estimate remains consistent. Between 30 and 50 guards died at the hands of American soldiers on that day. At first glance, a systematic purge, but in reality, a series of isolated, violent outbursts. This is still a significant number. This is still a war crime. But it is nowhere near the 538 claimed by Buechner. The truth lies in the paperwork of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph M. Whitaker. He was the Assistant Inspector General for the 7th Army. On May 2, 1945, Major General Arthur White ordered a formal inquiry. He wanted answers. Whitaker arrived at Dachau on May 3rd. He didn't just look around. He spent weeks there. He interviewed witnesses. He collected forensic data. He mapped the shootings. His report, finalized on June 8, 1945, is brutal in its detail. Title: Investigation of Alleged Mistreatment of German Guards at Dachau. The findings were specific. 16 guards shot in the coal yard, 1 guard killed by a vengeful inmate, 17 guards shot at Tower B, a handful of others killed in scattered locations. The total killed by U.S. troops stood at approximately 30 to 40. Liberated prisoners, in their fury, killed anywhere from 25 to 50 more. Whitaker was clear. These were summary executions, not combat deaths. The Germans had surrendered. They were unarmed. They were prisoners of war. The laws of war had been broken. But there was a darker twist to this violence. Whitaker's investigation uncovered a cruel irony. The men killed by American bullets were not the architects of the Holocaust. They were not the guards who had run Dachau for 12 years. Commandant Weiss was gone. He and the regular SS guards had fled on April 26th. They saw the end coming and escaped. The men left behind were replacements. Some were inmates from an SS disciplinary prison. Others were Hungarian Waffen-SS troops who had been transferred to Dachau only days prior. Most had never walked the perimeter of a concentration camp before that week. They were simply unlucky. They held the post when the Americans arrived. Were they innocent? No, they wore the uniform. They stood guard over a death camp. But they were not the torturers of 1933. Those men were miles away. The Americans did not check identification cards. They did not hold trials. In their rage over the death train and the rotting corpses, they killed the uniform. Individual guilt did not matter. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks commanded the battalion. He saw the bodies. He saw the train. Later, he wrote about April 29th with a heavy mix of pride and regret. He insisted his soldiers were not monsters. They were men pushed to the breaking point by the sights and smells of a living hell. The rage was understandable, But the result was a violation of the code they swore to uphold. The story ends here. 30 to 50 bodies. That was the official count on the ground. Colonel Sparks did not hesitate when the noise began. He heard the sharp crack of rifles coming from the coal yard. He did not wait for a report. He ran toward the sound. Sparks drew his service pistol. He aimed the weapon directly at his own men. He threatened to shoot any American soldier who fired another round at the prisoners. The order was absolute. The shooting stopped immediately. Sparks later estimated the casualties inflicted by his battalion, 30 guards, perhaps 50. For the rest of his life, he defended his troops. He insisted that the horrors inside Dachau justified their reaction. But this was only the beginning. In the light of the conditions that greeted the combat troops, Sparks believed justice could not be served by blaming individuals. However, the violence was not limited to men in uniform. The liberated prisoners also wanted blood. An American chaplain recorded a testimony from 3 young Jewish men. They had found a sadistic SS guard hiding in a barn. The German was dressed in peasant clothes to escape detection. It did not work. They beat him until he stopped breathing. Other witnesses described scenes of total chaos. Prisoners grabbed shovels. They picked up heavy stones and wooden clubs. Guards were thrown against brick walls. They were beaten until they were nothing more than motionless shapes on the ground. Polish prisoner Walenty Lenarchuk described the moment. The crowd swarmed over the barbed wire. They lifted the Americans onto their shoulders in celebration. Then they turned their attention to the Germans. They knocked the SS men down. The dust in the crowd made it hard to see the details. But the result was clear. The guards were stomped to death. Lenarchuk summed up the sentiment. For years they were animals to the guards. Today was their birthday. Why did the violence escalate so quickly? Thousands of prisoners were suddenly free. But hunger and vengeance drove their actions. The exact number of guards killed by the inmates remains unknown. Estimates range from a few individuals to over 50. Guards who failed to run were torn apart. One witness saw 2 prisoners beat a guard to death with a shovel. Another watched a prisoner stomp repeatedly on a guard's face. The blows continued until the face was unrecognizable. These were not combat deaths. These were lynchings, mob justice. At first glance, a liberation, but in reality, a massacre. The American soldiers did not stop it. In many cases, they encouraged the slaughter. The footage suggests a breakdown of discipline. Some soldiers handed their weapons to the prisoners. Others stood guard and watched as the inmates beat the Germans to death. Many simply looked the other way. The liberation of Dachau had become a bloodbath. And here, the story confronts an impossible moral question. Were these killings justified? The soldiers and prisoners would argue yes. These guards were part of a system that murdered tens of thousands. Even the replacements who had arrived days earlier wore the SS uniform. The death train proved their guilt. The camp conditions proved their complicity. Shooting them was not murder, it was justice. But international law says no. The Geneva Conventions are clear. Prisoners of war must be treated humanely. Summary executions are war crimes. Revenge killings violate the rules that separate civilization from barbarism. If we execute prisoners without trial, we become the enemy. The rule of law dies. American military leadership understood this dilemma immediately. Major General Arthur White ordered an investigation just 3 days after the liberation. Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker spent weeks documenting the events. He collected testimonies. He mapped the timeline. The U.S. Army knew its soldiers had committed war crimes. The question was what to do about it. Whitaker identified the shooters. Lieutenant Walsh admitted to killing 4 Germans in the boxcar. Other soldiers were named in sworn statements. Whitaker had enough evidence to court-martial multiple Americans for murder. But he also understood the context. These men had been in combat for over 500 consecutive days. They had lost 3/4 of their division to casualties. They had seen friends die. Then they walked into Dachau. They saw the death train. They smelled the decay. They saw the systematic murder. On December 31st, 1945, Colonel Charles made the final decision. November the 31st, 1945. Colonel Charles L. Decker made the final call. He sat at his desk and reviewed the investigation files. The evidence was clear. War crimes had occurred. But Decker did not sign the arrest warrants. Why did the Army choose silence over law? It seemed like a cover-up, but the reality was far more complex. Decker wrote his conclusion firmly. Technically, the SS guards were shot without trial. It was a violation of the letter of international law. But context mattered. Decker described the conditions that greeted the eyes of the first combat troops, the piles of bodies, the smell of burning flesh. He concluded that seeking justice for the dead guards was impossible. Equity did not demand it. The task of fixing individual responsibility was abandoned. The folder was closed. No charges were filed. No courts-martial were convened. The American soldiers who lined up the SS guards against the wall faced no punishment. The U.S. Army decided the event was understandable. Perhaps it was even inevitable. But this decision sparked a firestorm. Critics argued that looking away was dangerous. It undermined the moral authority of the Nuremberg trials. The United States was prosecuting German leaders for violating the laws of war. Yet, American soldiers had done the same thing. They killed without trial. They faced no consequences. At first glance, a necessary mercy for traumatized soldiers. But in reality, a disturbing example of victor's justice. Defenders of the decision drew a hard line. They pointed to the scale. The difference was clear. The SS at Dachau ran a death factory for 12 years. They murdered tens of thousands. They used starvation, disease, and medical experiments as weapons. The American soldiers were different. They spent only a few hours at Dachau. They saw the death train filled with corpses. They snapped. In a blind rage, they killed 30 to 50 guards. Both groups violated the laws of war, but one was calculated evil. The other was spontaneous revenge. Lieutenant Walsh never apologized. He was the man who shot the 4 surrendered Germans. In a 1990 interview, he looked directly at the interviewer. The footage shows an old man with hard eyes, unblinking. He spoke without hesitation. He did not believe the SS wondered why they were dying. They knew. Walsh made a promise. He said he would check on them when he got to hell. He believed he did the right thing. He believed the guards deserved to die. He served his country for the rest of his life. He lived without regret. Events accelerated. General Dwight Eisenhower visited Ordros concentration camp on April 12, 1945. It was just a week after liberation. He walked through the gates and stopped. He saw the bodies stacked like cordwood. He understood immediately. The world needed to see this. Eisenhower wrote that the sights beggared description. The visual evidence was overpowering. The testimony of starvation and bestiality made him physically sick. But he did not turn away. He made the visit deliberately. He wanted first-hand evidence. He knew that in the future, people would call these allegations propaganda. He wanted to be the witness who could say, "I saw it." He issued an order. German civilians from nearby towns were forced to come to the camps. He wanted them to see what their government had done. He wanted them to face the reality of the Holocaust. At Dachau, the process was brutal. Civilians marched through the camp gates. They walked past the death train. They stood in front of the crematorium ovens. Then, the soldiers handed them shovels. The order was given, bury the dead. 9,000 inmates lay decomposing in the camp. The civilians had to move them. Some Germans claimed they didn't know about the camp. Some said they heard rumors but didn't believe them. Others admitted the truth. They knew, but they did nothing. The camera records, well-dressed civilians breaking down. A woman vomits into the dirt. A man collapses from shock while holding a shovel. The sight of the camp broke them. The liberation of Dachau ended, but the questions remained. First, should the American soldiers have been prosecuted? The Army said no. They cited extenuating circumstances. But does trauma justify a war crime? Does seeing genocide excuse committing murder? These questions have no clean answers. Second, consider the prisoners. Were they justified in killing the guards? International law says no, but the moral question is harder. Can we honestly tell people who survived years of torture that they should have shown restraint, that they should have let their tormentors live? The story cuts off here. April 29, 1945. On this date, the rulebook for civilized warfare was discarded. Does the brutality of an enemy release a soldier from the law? If the opponent is a monster, does the liberator have the right to use monstrous methods? Every generation is forced to answer this question anew. At Dachau, American troops made their choice. They decided the SS guards deserved no mercy. Their commanders chose not to prosecute. The government accepted the report and moved on. Why did the command look away? It seemed like a violation of every military code. But the scale of the horror changed the rules. 79 years later, historians still argue over the verdict. Was this justice, or was it a betrayal of the values the United States claimed to uphold? The soldiers who breached the camp gates believed they were acting correctly. Yet, the aftermath was heavy. Many carried the guilt for decades. Some defended the executions proudly. Others refused to speak a word. But they all understood one fact. On that day, they crossed a line. They ceased to be liberators. They became executioners. They stopped following the manual and began acting on rage. And the question lingers. Were they wrong? Consider the reality of those men. 500 days of combat. They had lost 3/4 of their friends to shrapnel and sniper fire. They were exhausted. Then, they turned a corner. The footage shows 39 railway boxcars parked on the tracks. Inside them, 2,310 corpses. The smell of decay was overwhelming. The soldiers entered the camp proper. In the frame, 32,000 emaciated prisoners, walking skeletons. Beyond them, 9,000 unburied bodies rotting in the open air. This was the context. The Americans looked at the men in SS uniforms. They knew these guards were part of the machinery that built this hell. The standard procedures collapsed. No one thought about processing them as prisoners of war. No one thought about handing them over for a judge to decide their fate. The soldiers did exactly what their instincts demanded. They pulled the triggers. The Dachau Massacre forces a confrontation with a difficult truth. There is a gap between law and morality, between what is legal and what is just. At first glance, the guards were surrendering soldiers, but in reality, they were symbols of absolute evil. Technically, the SS men executed on April 29th committed no specific crime witnessed by the Americans in that moment. They were simply standing in the wrong place. They wore the wrong uniform. But they were cogs in a system that murdered millions. The American troops decided that was enough. The United States Army agreed. The case was closed without a single charge filed. The lesson was brutal. Sometimes, in the face of overwhelming darkness, good men commit terrible acts. Sometimes these acts are punished, sometimes they are ignored. And sometimes, history remembers the perpetrators as heroes regardless. The soldiers who liberated Dachau are honored today, rightfully so. They ended 12 years of Nazi tyranny in that sector. They saved 32,000 human lives. They witnessed the Holocaust firsthand and ensured the world could not deny it. They are remembered for the liberation, not the firing squads. But the full picture is necessary. We cannot sanitize the story. We cannot pretend the day was purely heroic. The record remains stained. April 29th, 1945. On this date, the logic of the civilized world collapsed. American troops arrived at the gates of Dachau. They expected a prison. They found a graveyard. 39 rail cars sat on the tracks outside the camp. This was the death train. Inside the open wagons, bodies were stacked like firewood. 2,310 corpses, men, women, children. The smell of decomposition hung heavy in the spring air. It choked the soldiers. It clung to their uniforms. Why did disciplined soldiers break their oaths? They were trained to follow the Geneva Convention, but the sight of the train destroyed their restraint. At first glance, a humanitarian rescue, but in reality, a scene of primal vengeance. Liberation and execution happened simultaneously. The barrier between justice and war crime evaporated. Soldiers did not just unlock the gates, they gathered the SS guards. They marched them to the coal yard. They lined them up against a masonry wall. The footage shows German soldiers with hands raised, terrified. The camera records American GIs checking the actions of their rifles. There was no trial, No jury, no verdict. Machine gun fire erupted. The guards fell. 30 to 50 men died in minutes. Some were finished off with pistol shots to the head. The survivors of the camp watched from behind the wire. They cheered. The liberators had become the executioners. Both events are true. The rescue of 32,000 prisoners, the murder of unarmed guards. It is impossible to sanitize this history. These were young Americans, mostly in their 20s. They had fought across France and Germany for 2 years. They had seen friends blown apart by artillery. They were exhausted. They were traumatized. Then they walked into Dachau. The psychological dam broke. Confronted with industrial genocide, their moral compass shattered. The investigation began almost immediately. A lieutenant colonel documented the shootings. Photos were taken of the bodies at the wall. Testimony was collected. But this was only the beginning. The file reached the desk of General George Patton. He did not order a court-martial. He did not arrest the shooters. He reportedly took the papers and burned them. The U.S. Army decided that prosecuting these men served no purpose. Was this justice? No. It was a cover-up. But consider the alternative, putting men on trial who had just stopped a factory of death. It would have destroyed lives without undoing the horror. The decision was pragmatic. Yet, it created a dark precedent. It suggested that if the enemy is evil enough, the rules no longer apply. That revenge is acceptable if the provocation is extreme. That precedent makes us uncomfortable. It should. It reveals the raw texture of conflict. War is not a clean contest between good and evil. It is chaos. It is brutality. It forces impossible choices on good men. The images remain. The testimony exists. In the frame, the bodies of the SS guards lie in the weeds. The sound of weeping survivors mixes with the report of rifles. The 2,310 dead on the train matter. The 32,000 survivors matter. The 12 years of Nazi terror matter. And the Americans who pulled the trigger matter. History demands the full complexity. Not a simple fable of heroes, but the jagged reality. On that day, justice looked exactly like revenge. Liberation looked like murder. 79 years later, the question remains unanswered. When does a soldier cross the line? The answer is sometimes found at the wall in Dachau. We do not remember this to condemn the liberators. We do not remember it to excuse the war crime. We remember it to understand. War damages the soul. In the shadow of the death train, there were no heroes, only survivors.